Alright, we're going to talk about introductions in this module, introductions, inclusions, particularly the types, and all this is going to relate to how you're going to write your introduction and your conclusion for your research paper, but it really could relate to any type of paper and certainly will relate to the summative that's coming up pretty soon. Okay, all this goes back to the writer's model, which is something I introduced to you at the very beginning. And everything is in this metaphor of the puzzle. And as I said, everything flows towards the purpose. The purpose is going to really dictate everything you write has to have a purpose. Everything you read has to have a purpose if it's well written. So that's the key, is what we're going to focus on. So first thing we're going to look at is the different types of introductions. Remember, that has to do with we're talking about the whole piece, okay? And the whole piece is going to lead towards other puzzle pieces. In this case, we're going to focus on the introductions. And if we move down here, we talked about the different types of introductions. We had the factual, we had the descriptive question, story question, narrative, and the direct. And remember, we said that the reason that we drew an X around the direct was that that is the one type of introduction that we want to avoid using the most. Let me show you an example of an article that you read before. And this article is called, or is the 9/11 article that we worked on before. And what I'd like to do is see if I can get a color. Okay, so you'll notice that the article is actually several different people writing about their experience at 9/11. It's actually a narrative, and most of these pieces, each told by a different person, like this one is Joshua Walfish. Each one is told by a different person, and each one is in the style of, the overall thing is in the style of narrative. However, you'll notice that this particular, or there is one that isn't truly a narrative. Okay, because it's a narrative, then that's going to affect the type of introduction you choose, as well as the type of conclusion. In this case, the type of introduction is quite clearly a narrative. Okay, and you'll notice that it says, what started out as a beautiful sunny day in Rockville, Maryland, ended with images of darkness that will be etched in my mind for the rest of my life. Again, this is a piece of journalism, so it works for that. If you're writing a rather long or a longer type essay like an expository, this would be a good hook, but not a whole introduction, so you'd have to add a little bit more to that, such as a thesis. However, from this introduction, we can tell what the person is going to talk about in the rest of the piece. Now, we're going to talk about the introduction and conclusion together because a well-written paper is going to have a sense of completion, as if you've gone through a full circle. So if you look at the next or the last passage here, it says, I can't believe it has been 10 years, those heinous and terrible attacks, or since those heinous and terrible attacks. I don't remember much about life prior to them. I don't remember airport security, and I don't remember not being at war. This is something that is truly terrifying to me. As much as I have memories from the first 9.5 years of my life is defined by what unfolded from that day on. And I think the key here is this last sentence where it says, as much as I have memories from the first 9.5 years of my life is defined by what unfolded from that day on. And if you think about it, you have basically a summary type of conclusion, but also a future possibility of how his life is defined from that day on. And again, you can combine these. We said that when you're looking at what types of conclusions or introductions you're using, that's going to be dictated by, if you go all the way back to here, the piece of writing, the entire piece of writing. In this case, this piece of writing is narrative. And if we go into um, the next piece, you'll notice that this one starts out a little bit differently. And in this one it says, one by one my classmates were disappearing. My Solomon Schechter Hebrew class had started off like any other, but things had quickly become eerie as the school secretary entered the classroom every few minutes to inform one of my peers that he or she was excused from class for the morning. No one had told us why we were being excused or what was happening. Kids were just vanishing. This is a great narrative beginning, if you will, because it does have kind of a beginning, middle, and end, and the reader's waiting for what happened next. The next paragraph tells us exactly what happened next, and finally it continues into the conclusion, where it says, my classmates have been disappearing that morning because most parents felt such a catastrophic event needed to be shared with family, etc., etc. I remember feeling as though the event was so distant and unrelated to my life, and then coming home to find those planes had crashed straight through my family. And so again, we have definitely a type of summary conclusion there. And if you think about it, it also answers the so what question. Why are we sharing this information? Why is it important? Let's move on to the last one. And actually what I want to do is quickly, if I can, copy these two things here. And we'll go to the next one. In this piece, I like, or I had chosen from the 9/11 article for the reason that what we're looking at is one that is more of an expository essay than a narrative, and I think that's key, especially since it's a good segue into the research paper that we're doing. It starts out saying, when those towers hit the when those two planes hit the Twin Towers back in 2001, I was in 7th grade and I didn't know enough about the world to know that this shouldn't be happening to us. In some ways, I'll never know because I grew up in a world where terrorism is a possibility that has turned into a reality far too often. And if you think about it, the beginning part sets you up with a factual. Okay, that is, as we talked about right here, we talked about the factual type of introduction. It's something that happened. It's very specific. And then it leads into what the person is really going to focus on, and that's this part here, this last sentence, which you could almost say is your thesis statement. It says, in some ways, I'll never know because I grew up in a world where terrorism is a possibility that has turned into reality far too often. And then if you look at the rest of the body paragraphs, you'll notice that each of them talk about specific events that happen as you move on through his experience, and actually her experience, sorry. And then finally, when we get to the conclusion, it says, these are the times to remember, these are the times to reflect, and they are also the times in which we gather ourselves for what's ahead. We attempt to face the future with the same amount of hope we found in our elation over Osama's demise. And so, in essence, we have an example of future possibilities, and I think also perhaps you could argue that there might be even somewhat of an urge to act, which is unusual because usually that's reserved for a persuasive type of piece. But you'll notice that the key here is it gives you that sense of going back to the original idea up in the beginning, and it does give you a sense of closure, which is actually a very well written type of conclusion. So our next step would be to figure out how are we going to write that introduction